Elka Sorensen died on the 4th of January, 1939, in the back bedroom of her sister-in-law's house in Sheephorn, Montana, with the curtains open, because she had asked for the curtains open, and nobody argues with a dying woman about curtains. The room faced west, toward the granite ridge that rose above the valley like a wall built by something older than people. And Elka had spent the last 2 hours of her life looking at that ridge the way someone looks at a letter they've been writing for 20 years and never quite finished. Her daughter was holding her hand. Her daughter was 14 years old, and her name was Sigrid, and she was trying not to cry because her mother had told her once that tears don't fix anything, but clean water fixes almost everything. And if she was going to cry, she should at least collect the water and use it for something. That was how Elka talked. That was how Elka thought. Everything was water. Everything was measurement. Everything was coordinates. In the last 5 minutes of her life, Elka's eyes cleared the way eyes sometimes do at the end, as if the dying brain has decided to use up every last drop of clarity on one final effort. And she pulled her daughter close and whispered something that Sigrid would carry like a stone in her chest for 6 months before she understood it. She whispered, 46, 51, 12 north, 114, 03, 47 west. The big one. Go there. Dig where the lichen is thickest. Then she closed her eyes, and her hand went slack, and the room was quiet, and the ridge outside the window was still there. Unchanged, indifferent, the way mountains are always indifferent to the things that happen in their shadow. The funeral was on a Saturday. The ground was frozen solid, and they had to wait until the 3rd week of January for a thaw before they could dig. Reverend Toole read from Psalms, and 14 people attended, which was 12 more than Sigrid expected, because Elka Sorensen had not been what anyone in Sheephorn would call popular. She had been what they called strange. She was a small woman, Norwegian stock, with a face that was all angles and gray eyes that looked at things the way a surveyor's transit looks at things. Measuring, calculating, recording. She walked the granite ridge above the valley with a compass and a field book and a length of rope knotted at meter intervals. And she had been walking it since 1922, which was 17 years. Which was longer than some of the marriages in the valley and certainly more productive. Though the valley didn't see it that way. The ranchers called her the compass woman. The postmaster's wife said she was touched. Elka's brother-in-law, a man named Dale Pratt, who ran 300 head of cattle on the valley floor and hadn't looked up at the ridge in 20 years, said at the funeral, not quietly, not with any attempt at discretion, she left the girl a bag of rocks and a bunch of numbers. That's what 17 years of wandering gets you. Sigrid stood at the grave, in a sheepskin vest that had been her mother's and a flour sack dress that she'd sewn herself because Elka had taught her to sew the same way Elka taught her everything. By measurement, by precision, by doing it until it was right. She wore heavy square-toed boots laced to the knee that were her mother's, and fit her because Sigrid had Elka's feet, which were small and narrow and tougher than they looked. She did not look at Dale. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the ridge because the ridge was where the coordinates pointed, and the coordinates were the last thing her mother had said. And the last thing a dying person says is either meaningless or the most important thing they've ever said. And Sigrid intended to find out which. If you want to find out what Elka Sorensen spent 17 years measuring on that granite ridge, and why an entire valley would come to depend on it when the crops turned black, subscribe to Hollow and Harvest and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what her daughter found at those coordinates is a story that turned a bag of numbers into the only thing standing between a valley and starvation. Sigrid had been living with Dale and his wife Vera since November, when Elka became too sick to care for herself. Elka's husband, Sigrid's father, a man named Sorensen, had died in 1931, thrown from a horse that stepped in a prairie dog hole on the flats south of town. He'd broken his neck. He was 34. Elka had been walking the ridge since before Niels died. She continued walking it after. The county considered taking Sigrid, a single woman with no income who spent her days on a mountainside with a compass, was, in the opinion of the county welfare office, an uncertain guardian. But Vera intervened. Vera was Dale's wife, but she was also Elka's friend, or the closest thing Elka had to a friend, which was someone who didn't actively think she was crazy. Vera told the county that Sigrid would stay with her family if Elka couldn't care for her. And the county agreed because it saved them the paperwork. Dale's house was comfortable, well built, and governed by a man who believed that land was for cattle, and mountains were for looking at, and women who walked around with compasses were wasting daylight that could be spent doing something useful. He did not forbid Sigrid from going to the ridge. He did something worse. He ignored it. When Sigrid mentioned her mother's field book, Dale said, "Mm-hmm." When she asked if she could have the surveying rope, he said, "It's in the barn." When she said the coordinates her mother whispered might be important, Dale said, "Your mother was dying. People say things when they're dying. It doesn't mean anything." Vera, sitting at the kitchen table, said nothing. But she looked at Sigrid the way Elka used to look at the ridge, like she was measuring something she hadn't finished calculating. Elka had left Sigrid the homestead, 80 acres on the north side of the valley, running from the sagebrush flat up the slope of the granite ridge to the ridgeline itself. The cabin was small, sound, and full of paper. Not notebooks this time. Maps. Hand-drawn survey maps, executed with the precision of a professional cartographer, covering every square foot of the granite ridge above the property. Elka had used a compass, a clinometer, 100-foot steel tape she'd ordered from a survey supply company in Butte, and a field book, a leather-bound book with gridded pages where she recorded bearings, distances, elevations, and something else. Water readings. At each station point on her survey grid, she'd recorded the moisture content of the lichen growing on the granite, the temperature of the rock surface at dawn, the presence or absence of frost crystals in the crevices, and the sound the rock made when she tapped it with a steel rod. She developed a notation system. Symbols for hollow below, seep present, fracture wet, fracture dry. The maps were dense with these symbols, and when Sigrid laid them all on the cabin floor in order, they formed a picture of the ridge that nobody else had ever seen. A network of underground water moving through fractures in the granite, collecting in natural basins and surfacing at specific points that Elka had marked with precise surveyor's coordinates. 14 coordinates, 14 water sources, mapped over 17 years. The field book contained temperature logs, flow rate estimates, and seasonal variation data for each site. The largest, the one Elka had whispered, was at the base of a granite outcrop on the north face of the ridge, at an elevation of 5,240 feet, marked in the field book as Cistern 1. Elka had estimated its capacity at 40,000 gallons. She had written, in the margin beside the estimate, in handwriting that was small and precise even in the last year of her illness, "This one feeds a stream. The stream runs underground for 200 feet and surfaces in the draw below the red rock. This is permanent water. This does not fail. Not in drought, not in any drought. The mountain holds it." The first spring alone was not hard the way the other story's springs were hard. Sigrid was not starving. Dale's family had food, and Vera made sure Sigrid was fed, even after Sigrid moved back to the cabin in April. What was hard was the conversion, taking her mother's numbers and turning them into something physical. Coordinates on a page are just ink. Coordinates on a mountainside are a destination, and the destination required walking. Sigrid walked. She walked the ridge every day for 6 weeks with her mother's compass and field book and the knotted rope, retracing Elka's survey grid, finding each station point by its bearing and distance from the last, checking the readings against the maps. She learned to use the compass the way Elka had used it. Not as a tool for finding north, which is what most people use a compass for, but as a tool for finding specific points in space, for translating numbers into locations, for turning ink into ground truth. She learned to read the knotted rope. Each knot was 1 meter. And by stretching the rope from one station point along a bearing, she could find the next station point to within 6 inches, which was close enough when you were looking for a crack in a granite ridge that covered 40 acres. The numbers matched. Every symbol, every notation, every water indicator was exactly where Elka said it would be. The lichen was thickest over the fractures that carried water, because the lichen drew moisture from the stone, and the stone was wettest where the water flowed below. The rock was coldest at dawn over the deepest cisterns, because the water absorbed heat from the rock surface, cooling it from below the way a stream cools the ground beside it. The hollow sound under the steel rod marked the basins below, because air and water transmit sound differently than solid stone, and a trained ear can hear the difference between 2 feet of granite and 2 feet of granite with a void beneath it. Elka had spent 17 years training her ear. Sigrid trained hers in 6 weeks. She had her mother's ears, which were precise and patient, and didn't need the sound to be loud. They just needed it to be there. On a morning in May, Sigrid walked to the coordinates her mother had whispered. 46, 51, 12 north, 114, 03, 47 west. She stood at the base of a granite outcrop where the lichen was so thick it looked like the rock had grown a green skin. She knelt and put her ear to the stone, the way Elka's field book said to, and she heard it, not a sound exactly, but a vibration, a low, constant hum of water moving through rock below her knees. She took the steel rod from her pack and tapped the granite. Hollow. She tapped 3 feet to the left. Solid, 3 feet to the right. Hollow. The cistern was directly below her, and it was large, and it was full. She didn't have the tools to excavate. She didn't need to. The field book said Cistern 1 fed a stream that surfaced in the draw below the red rock, 200 feet downhill. She walked downhill, following the fracture line Elka had marked on the map. And at the base of a red granite slab, she found it, a seep barely visible. Water emerging from a crack in the rock and running across a shelf of moss before it sank back into the ground. She dug at the seep with her hands, widening the crack, and the water increased. Not a trickle, but a steady flow, cold and clear, tasting of mineral and stone. She sat on the granite shelf with water running over her boots, and she said, "You found it, Mama. You found it, and nobody listened." Then she cried, which Elka would not have approved of, but the water from her eyes ran into the water from the mountain, and at least it was being used for something. If this story is reaching something in you, subscribe to Hollow and Harvest, because what Elka spent 17 years mapping and what her daughter found when she finally walked to those coordinates is only the beginning. The ridge had more water than one girl could use, and the valley below was about to need every drop. Gregor Vasek came to the cabin in June. He was 69 years old, Croatian, with a white mustache stained yellow from 40 years of pipe tobacco, and a barrel chest that looked like it had been built to carry granite, which it had. He'd been a stone cutter in the quarries outside Butte for 28 years before his lungs filled with dust, and the company doctor told him to find a different way to die. He'd moved to the Bitterroot Valley in 1932 because the air was clean and the mountains were granite, and granite was the only thing Gregor Vasek had ever understood completely. He'd known Elka. He was the one person in the valley who had looked at her maps and not laughed. His first words to Sigrid were, "Your mother showed me the field book in 1934. I told her the cisterns were real. She said she knew. She said she needed someone who could open them. I told her I would when the time was right. The time is right. Show me cistern 1. Gregor read Granite the way Marta read the forest floor, and Opal read the hollow, and Pekka read the mine walls. He put his scarred hands flat on the rocks and closed his eyes and said, "The fracture runs northeast to southwest. The basin is 8 feet below. The stone is thin here, 2 feet, maybe less. We don't blast. We channel." Channeling was a quarryman's technique, using a series of shallow drill holes along a fracture line, then splitting the rock with steel wedges driven in sequence so the stone opened along its natural grain instead of shattering. It was precise work, delicate for something involving hammers and steel. And Gregor did it the way a surgeon works. Slowly, feeling for the resistance that told him where the rock wanted to break. It took 3 days. On the 3rd afternoon, the last wedge split the cap rock, and the cistern opened like a mouth, and water surged upward through the gap. Cold and fast, pooling on the granite shelf and spilling over the edge into the draw below. Sigrid measured the flow with a bucket and a pocket watch. 2 gallons per minute, 120 gallons per hour. Nearly 3,000 gallons per day. From 1 cistern. Elka had mapped 14. She built the irrigation system through the summer and fall of 1939. Gregor showed her how to cut channels in granite, shallow V-shaped grooves that directed water downhill by gravity without pipes, pumps, or anything that could break in a Montana winter. The water from the cistern 1 flowed through the channel, down the draw, across the slope, and into a holding pond she dug at the upper edge of the flat ground below the ridge. From the pond, she ran ditches, simple earthen ditches lined with clay she dug from the creek bottom, to the 2 acres of arable land on the property that Elka had identified in the field book as suitable for cultivation if irrigated. The soil was thin, but mineral-rich. Decomposed granite mixed with centuries of organic matter from the sagebrush that grew above it. With water, it could grow anything. She planted in the spring of 1940. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, kale, lettuce, beans. The standard homestead crops, planted in rows that followed the contour of the slope so the irrigation water moved slowly along each row instead of cutting straight downhill and washing the soil away. But she also planted wheat. Not the common hard red winter wheat that every rancher in the valley grew. A variety developed for flatland farming with deep topsoil and reliable rainfall, neither of which existed on a granite slope. But an old Norwegian variety her mother had brought from her own mother's seed stock, a spring wheat called Svalov that matured in 80 days and had a tolerance for cold nights and thin soil that the commercial varieties couldn't match. Elka had written about it in the field book in an entry dated April 1937, 2 years before she died. Planted Svalov on the upper terrace. Mother's seed. This wheat was bred for coastal Norway. Short growing season, poor soil, cold maritime climate. The granite slope is not Norway, but it shares the constraints. Cold nights, thin mineral soil, reliable water from below. If this wheat can grow in Stavanger, it can grow on granite. She planted it on the upper terrace where the granite channel delivered water directly to the rows, cold and mineral heavy, 44 degrees from the mountain's interior. By July, the wheat was waist-high and green in a way that looked almost aggressive against the brown sagebrush surrounding it. By August, it was golden, heavy heads bending the stalks, the grain fat and hard and ready. She harvested by hand, cutting with a sickle Gregor had sharpened on a quarry stone until the edge could split a hair, bundling the sheaves and stacking them in the cabin to dry. 40 bushels from a quarter acre, a yield that would have been respectable on the best bottomland in the valley, and on granite slope soil fed by mountain water. It was extraordinary. She ground the first flour on a hand mill she'd bought with money from selling potatoes at the store in Hamilton. The bread she baked from it was dense and nutty, and tasted like something her mother would have understood. Practical, specific, made from numbers and patience, and a seed that had traveled from Norway to Montana in a woman's pocket and waited there for the right piece of ground. The valley noticed. Sigrid Sorensen wasn't buying flour at the store. Sigrid Sorensen was carrying sacks of wheat to the mill in Hamilton. Sigrid Sorensen had a garden that produced in August when other gardens were struggling in the heat. The postmaster's wife, who had called Elka touched, told her husband that the Compass woman's daughter is growing wheat on a rock. Her husband said that was impossible. She said, then explain the flour. The blight arrived in the summer of 1941. Wheat stem rust, Puccinia graminis, a fungal disease that turns wheat stalks orange and then black and then dead. It came up from the south on the wind, the way it always does, carrying spores from infected fields in Idaho and eastern Montana. By late July, every wheat field in the Bitterroot Valley was showing orange pustules on the stems. By August, the stalks were snapping at the base and the grain was shriveling inside the husks. The rust spread faster than anyone had seen. 3 weeks from first appearance to total crop failure across the valley. Ranchers who depended on wheat for feed and flour and cash found themselves looking at black fields that smelled like mold and produced nothing. Sigrid's wheat survived. Not because Svalov was resistant to stem rust. It wasn't. Not entirely. But because the granite-filtered water from Cistern 1 was cold, mineral-heavy, and slightly alkaline, and the soil it irrigated was well-drained granite decomposition that didn't hold the moisture the rust fungus needed to thrive. The rust requires warm, humid conditions at the soil surface to spread. Sigrid's terrace was dry, windswept, cold at night, and irrigated from below by water that came out of the mountain at 44 degrees. The fungal spores landed, but they couldn't establish. The wheat turned gold, while the valley turned black. She harvested 38 bushels, slightly less than the previous year because the summer had been dry, but 38 bushels more than anyone else in the county produced. They came in September. Not a crowd. Montana ranchers don't crowd. They came in trucks with empty grain bins and faces that looked like the fields, which is to say damaged and trying not to show it. Dale Pratt came. He came in his cattle truck, which he had not loaded with cattle because the cattle had nothing to eat, because the wheat he grew for winter feed was black in the field. He stood at Sigrid's gate and looked at the granite channel running water down from the ridge and the golden stubble on the upper terrace where she'd harvested, and the holding pond with its clay-lined ditches, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother's numbers." Sigrid said, "My mother's numbers." Dale said, "They're real." Sigrid said, "They were always real." She gave him seed wheat. She gave it to everyone who came. The Svalov variety, her mother's Norwegian stock, along with instructions for planting on well-drained soil with cold water irrigation. She drew maps, the way Elka had drawn maps, with precise measurements and careful notation, showing each family how to find the seep lines and fracture patterns on their own land, because the granite ridge ran the length of the valley, and the water beneath it didn't belong to one property. She opened 3 more cisterns that fall with Gregor's help. Cisterns 3, 7, and 11 from Elka's maps. Each one feeding a channel that could irrigate another family's land. By the spring of 1942, there were 5 families growing Svalov wheat on granite-sloped terraces fed by cistern water. And the rust that came back that summer found the same cold, dry, alkaline conditions and failed again. If you're watching this Hollow and Harvest story and you know what it feels like to have someone reduce your mother's life to a bag of numbers, hit the like button. It's free, and it helps these stories reach people who need them. Dale came back alone in October. He walked up the ridge to the granite outcrop where Cistern 1 had been opened, and stood there looking at the water flowing through the channel Gregor had cut. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I told you your mother's numbers didn't mean anything." Sigrid was reinforcing the channel wall where winter frost had loosened a stone. She set down her chisel and said, "I remember." Dale said, "I was wrong. I was wrong about her, and I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about this ridge. She saw something under the rock that I couldn't see from my porch, and I should have walked up here at least once in 20 years and looked." Sigrid picked up the chisel. "Mama would have shown you everything," she said. "She wanted to show people. Nobody came." Dale took off his hat. It was the only time Sigrid ever saw him without it. He said, "I'm sorry about the funeral. What I said." Sigrid said, "The water doesn't hold grudges. It just runs. That's what my mother loved about it. Water doesn't stop to argue about whether it should exist. It just flows where the rock tells it to flow." Dale put his hat back on and walked down the ridge. And the next morning, he sent his son up with a wagon full of fencing posts for the garden, which was not an apology, but was the closest Dale Pratt ever came to building one with his hands. A man came that winter. Soren Breck, a hydrologist from Missoula, who had read a county extension report about granite cistern irrigation and driven 60 miles to see it himself. He came to measure water flow and stayed because he found a system that his textbook said shouldn't exist. Natural granite basins collecting snowmelt through fracture networks and storing it underground in volumes that could sustain year-round irrigation without wells, pumps, or electricity. He said it was passive water infrastructure that predates human settlement by 10,000 years. He looked at Elka's field book and her survey maps, and he said, "This woman was a hydrologist. She just didn't have the degree." He mapped the entire cistern network using Elka's coordinates as starting points and confirmed all 14 sites. He published a paper in the Montana Water Resources Journal with the title, "Natural Granite Cistern Systems in the Bitterroot Range, a Survey of Passive Water Storage." He credited Elka Sorensen on the first page. Sigrid checked the spelling twice. He also stayed for another reason. He had steady hands and a quiet way of looking at problems that reminded Sigrid of the water itself. Patient, persistent, always finding the path of least resistance without ever stopping. They married in the spring of 1943 at the granite outcrop above Cistern 1, with Gregor as witness and the sound of water running through stone as the only music either of them needed. Gregor died in the winter of 1946, 76 years old. His lungs finally completing the argument the quarry dust had started 30 years before. He asked to be buried on the ridge above the cisterns, where the granite was clean and the air was clean and the water ran through stone. He understood better than he understood anything else in his life. Sigrid and Soren dug the grave in frozen ground that Gregor would have known how to read. The fracture lines, the grain, the places where the rock would give and the places where it wouldn't. They put his pipe on the headstone. It's still there, the bowl stained yellow, the stem bitten through on one side, the only thing Gregor Vasek ever left behind that wasn't made of stone. The university came in 1952. A team from Montana State who spent a summer mapping the entire fracture network beneath the ridge using Elka's coordinates and modern seismic equipment. They confirmed that the granite cistern system held an estimated 200,000 gallons of water at any given time, enough to irrigate 50 acres year-round without depletion, because the system recharged from snowmelt every spring faster than it could be drawn down. The lead geologist called it one of the most significant passive water resources in the northern Rockies. Sigrid showed him the field book. He read it standing on the ridge with the wind pushing his hair sideways and said, "Your mother mapped this with a compass and a knotted rope." Sigrid said, "And a steel rod, and 17 years." He shook his head. "We brought $20,000 of equipment and 4 graduate students, and we confirmed what she already knew." Sigrid said, "She would have liked the graduate students. She didn't get many visitors." Soren built the cistern program into a county water management model that was adopted across western Montana. He died in 1981, in the cabin, in the bed Elka had built from lodgepole pine. Sigrid buried him beside Gregor on the ridge. Their daughter took over the property. Their granddaughter learned to read the field book. The cisterns still hold water. The channels still run. The granite still hums when you put your ear to it. The way Elka taught Sigrid. The way Sigrid taught her daughter. The way the mountain has been humming since before anyone was there to listen. People talk about last words like they're supposed to be wise. Most last words aren't wise. Most last words are confused or afraid or simply the last thing a dying brain can push through a failing mouth. But some last words are coordinates. Some last words are the most precise thing a person has ever said, compressed into numbers because numbers are how they love the world and numbers are what they trust their daughter to decode. 46, 51, 12 north, 114, 03, 47 west. That's not a dying woman's confusion. That's a 17-year survey delivered in 12 seconds to the only person who would understand it. That's the most important sentence Elka Sorensen ever spoke. And she saved it for last because she knew there wouldn't be time for the explanation. The explanation was in the field book. The coordinates were enough. The daughter would do the rest. If you've ever lost someone who tried to tell you something the world said was worthless, a location, a measurement, a piece of knowledge that nobody else valued, go back. Look at what they left you. Open the book. Follow the numbers. Walk to the coordinates. Because somewhere on the other side of those numbers is the thing they spent their life finding and the thing they used their last breath to give you. And the mountain is still holding it. Thank you for watching this Hollow and Harvest story. If it reminded you that the most important inheritance might be a set of numbers whispered by someone who loved you, please share it. Subscribe to Hollow and Harvest for more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary things in the places the world passed by. And tell me in the comments, what's the last thing someone told you that you didn't understand until later?